Of the Federalist Radio Hour, a kind of emergency weekend edition, just because the second impeachment of Donald Trump crept into the weekend and actually had some interesting things happen. I'm happy to be joined today by two colleagues, Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at the Federalist, and Molly Hemingway, senior editor at the Federalist. Emily, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm great, Ben. I can't wait to talk about this impeachment round two. Deja vu.
And Molly, how are you?
I'm doing great, except for the family having lost heat a few days ago. So we are on day 2 of 5 days of no heat, but we are alive. We made it. And that has nothing to do with impeachment, but that's my main point of concern right now.
Well, I have to say that I'm a little disheveled because I was just doing what I actually think I became. I know I've been a father for a while, but I think I became a dad today because I had the thought, I need to go and scrape the car off so it doesn't turn into an ice cube overnight. And our car was recently vandalized in DC, which has experienced a massive uptick, by the way, in carjackings. So be safe out there. And so because of that, at some point in the taking stuff out and putting back in, I had lost my scraper for the car. And so I realized, wait a minute, that guy gave me a metal business card and this will be handy. And I went out there and I scraped the entire car off with a metal business card. And as I was doing it, I was like, this is the most dad thing I've ever done in my life. And the fact that I'm proud of it is also a dad thing.
Yes. But as you said once before, you've always had these fatherly tendencies.
So I wanted to talk about a couple different aspects of impeachment with you. But we have to talk, I think, before we get into anything else, about this weird thing that happened today with witnesses and what we got to see in real time in terms of the reaction from journos who cover Capitol Hill, cover Congress. They're supposed to do this for a living and be professional. They're not supposed to be rooting for a side. And their reaction of seeing this kind of out of nowhere call for witnesses on the part of the House managers, Jamie Raskin, vote on witnesses that included all the Democrats and 5 Republicans, including Lindsey Graham. And then this kind of chaos that came afterwards of people not even knowing what they had voted on, requesting from the chair, did we vote on one witness or did we vote on witnesses? And then having to take a recess to figure out what was going on. And meanwhile, all these journos spinning things heavily one way or the other, like, oh man, this is a huge new way to attack Donald Trump. This is going to be terrible for Republicans. And it's really going to, hurt them and stuff. And then the flip side, oh man, Republicans could actually use this to extend this impeachment trial out for 10 months, as Senator Kramer said on Fox. It was just this kind of chaotic thing that happened and then was resolved in a whimper when they came back. Tell me a little bit about your reaction to that, Molly, and what you saw when you were sort of paying attention to it.
I first off think it's interesting that the incentives of the House Democrats were not fully aligned with the incentives of the Senate Democrats. There is no reason why you don't want this to continue. If you're a House Democrat, you get to be, out there on a national stage. You get to seem like you're in the fight. And for like an hour or two, Senate Democrats thought that seemed like a good idea until some people kind of encourage them to think through the seriousness of the situation and what would happen if you truly allowed witnesses to come in here. There are 2 ways to do a trial. One is to really focus on an impeachment trial. One is to do it as if it were a criminal trial where you really think about due process and you bring out all the information you can and you have witnesses and evidence. And that clearly was never even like a tiny bit of what this trial was about. So it was a political trial. And as a political trial, there are advantages for Democrats, but there would have been also, by opening it up to witnesses, so many advantages for Republicans. They could have brought forth people who talked about why there were very few police there that day. That's not something Nancy Pelosi wants to talk about. That's probably not something that Mitch McConnell wants to talk about, or the mayor of Washington, D.C. You would have been able to, I was kind of actually thinking it would be fun to have a year-long trial with with witnesses where you really got to the bottom of what happened.
I would love to at least see Mayor Bowser be called upon to again, 150% up in terms of carjackings, but she did paint that plaza, so whatever. But like that whole back and forth about National Guard, like, are we never going to get to the bottom, I guess, of who really said, we should have National Guard, and who really said no, and the whole process that went into that?
Well, can I jump in on that? Because I think, it goes to show that, like, while they were sort of deriding Republicans like Josh Hawley for not paying attention allegedly to the proceedings, because they're saying, like, listen, these guys already have their mind made up and they're not interested in the substance. I think it's clear that Democrats actually weren't interested in the substance of debating this question of incitement. And incitement is actually you can define that in a million different ways. And when you have something as complicated as the president literally calling for peace to the group of people that walked down Pennsylvania and Constitution Avenue towards the Capitol, that's really not a clear-cut question, as it was depicted by Democrats over and over again over the course of this brief trial. And so I think as they're sort of deriding Republicans for not coming to this with a fair mind and an open mind, it's the exact same thing on their end. Like, this was political through and through, no matter how much they tried to preen about it being about principle. Sure, I'm sure some people out there were voting on their principle, but the tactic itself and the effort itself was political throughout. It was nothing less than that, and draping in this sort of sanctimonious language about principle, it's just a farce. It's completely a farce. All they wanted to do was bar Trump from running for office again.
So
I love. Go ahead, Molly.
Just that I think that another thing that the move to go for witnesses tells us is that, that wasn't part of the original plan. Everybody kind of had a plan for how this would be allowed to continue. Today, there's this surprise call for witnesses. And partly it was evocative of the very standard way you run an information op, where you drop information late in order to delay a proceeding. So you saw that with the Kavanaugh confirmation, you saw it with the Clarence Thomas confirmation, but you see it with a lot of information ops. So there was a lot being made of this. They were trying to sort of say, this thing that's been out there since January 12th or longer is new information that requires us to continue this trial. And, at the end of the day, that ended up not working. But I think the fact that they were even trying for it indicates that the managers weren't entirely pleased with how the trial had gone once Trump's defense had its way. Yeah. And so the first day of the Trump defense, I don't think anyone thinks that went particularly great for Trump. They might not have thought it was like a disaster, but it wasn't great. But by the end of yesterday, whether you think it's the quality of the attorneys or the quality of their arguments or just the quality of the reality of the situation, it was not a good moment for Democrats at the end of yesterday. And so that's why they kind of wanted to pull out some witnesses.
There was clearly, you don't try to pull that out of thin air, especially when this is already, while it got publicized more the other day, it had already been something that had been said publicly. And so it wasn't like, this was not new information. It was just kind of like, oh yeah, we should probably throw that thing in there. And I felt like Jonathan Turley did a really good job of tracking that and how the arguments shifted, and basically made the case that, like, Democrats, if they had actually been interested in impeaching and convicting Trump, would have spent way more time on this in the House and would have constructed something that was much more about Trump's personal actions, as opposed to trying to make this incitement claim, which really didn't pass muster with a lot of these Republican members of Congress who might have been convinced to join Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and the like, if there had perhaps been a more deliberative process. They tried to do that momentum thing, which I think was a mistake. I just wanted to point out a couple of things that I thought were amusing about this. A couple of people, in reaction to sort of me making fun of this on Twitter and a couple of other people making fun of it, were trying to make the argument that, oh, this is actually four-dimensional chess. This is something that they planned. This is something that, clearly was not, like, the Senate Democrats wouldn't have all voted along if this wasn't something that they intended to do. And I was saying, no, there's so many old people there, and they haven't been briefed by staff, because this was not something that I knew after the morning call. I spoke to somebody after the morning call, had gone out with the Democrats, and they said, well, Schumer this morning was saying emphatically, I don't want more witnesses. And that didn't get a lot of attention at the time because nobody assumed there would be witnesses. our friend Susan Ferricchio over at Washington Examiner reported this out, and there's this amusing little anecdote in her piece. So after Schumer goes and argues very hard on this 9 a.m. call, we don't need any more witnesses. We can deal with this today. We can move on to coronavirus relief, Biden agenda, et cetera. Senator Mazie Hirono said on Saturday that she did not see the need to call witnesses because it would not convince any new Republicans to vote to convict. Hirono then voted for witnesses moments later. and the thing that's happened is that Mazie Hirono, who is not exactly a spring chicken, has not had a conversation with a staffer in between her saying that outside of the Senate, walking into the Senate floor, having Raskin call for this, and then being faced with, oh, what am I supposed to do? I guess I should do what everybody else is doing. And so this really was a situation where I think they really stepped on a rake in a very obvious way. Ferricchio's reporting was followed up by a piece from Politico with a couple of different folks. That witness vote totally blindsided Senate Dems, who held a conference call at 9 a.m. and indicated they didn't think this would come up. House managers decided right before 10 a.m. to call that vote. So I think, Molly, to your point, this really was the folks from the House management side of things just taking over, basically, and wanting this to continue.
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't. It's hard when you're not down there to know exactly what was going on. But it was kind of funny to watch everything go down as well. And I thought it was interesting how so many reporters tried to make sense of it. They seem to be struggling with it in a deeply personal way. Yeah. They were revealing their deep desire for a conviction, and they were struggling with the fact that it wasn't happening. They feel like they have all this power, that they control the Democrat Party, then the Democratic Party controls the Senate and the House and the presidency, and they just couldn't make sense of it. And they were kind of flailing all over the place. I saw someone try to suggest that maybe Biden had sent the word out that he didn't want the trial to continue. Yes. Others were talking about how they realized that if Democrats could call witnesses, that so could Republicans. But if you just take it back to the original meaning behind this was never about this wasn't a real thing, in my view. Mm-hmm. It was always a political thing. And the goal was to separate the Republican Party from her voters by getting weak Republicans to vote with Democrats. So I'm just wondering, do you guys think that they succeeded in that goal or not? Obviously, there was an acquittal of the president. They got 7 Republicans to vote with them. I don't know what you think about the quality of those Republican votes, or do you think the Democratic ploy worked in some sense or no?
In some sense, I think yes, but overall, I think no, because if we're able to sort of put ourselves back on January 7th, January 6th, when the rumblings of another impeachment effort were becoming evident, there was this intense momentum among the sort of Liz Cheneys and the Mitt Romneys, and there was this real thought that they would finally be able to sever Donald Trump from the Republican Party, that this would be a convenient and effective purge of Trumpism because it was so, obviously something that they could pin to him, and it was so beyond the pale that they would be able to finally make that divorce happen. And then as the days went on, I think they realized that it wouldn't broadly be a good idea, or that it wouldn't really be possible to pull away. You're not going to, for instance, get Ted Cruz. You're not going to get some of those movement conservatives, real mainstream conservative politicians, to follow suit. And more importantly, I think they realized their base was in a much more sort of ideologically complicated position than they realized. And I say ideologically complicated because I don't think it's sort of pure MAGA loyalty in the way that some Republicans here in DC sort of will think of it contemptuously, and Democrats and the sort of progressives in the media like to think of it in that way contemptuously. But I also don't think, that it's this like pure Tea Party. It's not what either side wants to think it is. It's not what either side of the Republican Party wants to think it is. So I think as the days after January 6th wore on, they recognized that the situation was deeply complicated and that they would not be able to just swiftly purge Donald Trump from the Republican Party with an impeachment vote that, brought everyone over except for, say, Josh Hawley or Tommy Tuberville, something like that. And it didn't happen, right? Like they ended up with Mitt Romney, Ben Sasse, Murkowski, and Collins and Burr, and they didn't really peel anyone, potentially with the exception of Sasse, off. But that's, even that's a little bit of a stretch. They didn't really peel any mainstream people away.
So I will slightly disagree with you, but I think you're generally right. There are a couple things. First off, I think the person you need to include in that list, though, is McConnell, because McConnell also, I think, saw a window in this, and clearly it was something that was reported in the New York Times, at the time, and clearly was reported before, at a moment when McConnell world kind of thought we might have enough votes to do this. And the New York Times runs this piece that basically says McConnell is quietly whipping behind the scenes to see if he has enough votes to convict. Mm-hmm. Everybody goes berserk in Republican world on both sides of the argument. And one of the things that I think results from that is that McConnell kind of pulls his hand back from the fire. Now, McConnell, I think, is completely a tactical operator, and I often disagree with the tactics that he uses. He's best when he's either trying to get judges pushed through, trying to get something K Street wants pushed through, or doing nothing, as he did when it came to Merrick Garland. Doing nothing, he's great at doing nothing. I love any situation where there's like something conservative could result from McConnell doing nothing. I love those odds. Okay, but and I don't say that because I think he's a particularly bad guy. I just think he makes tactical mistakes. I think he made a tactical mistake of thinking that was something that could result from it, particularly because the donor base and the Republican base were actually pretty closely aligned on this. The corporate donors weren't. Okay, the corporate PAC money, that's gone. Republicans are going to lose that anyway. Whether it's culture issues or whatever. They're being replaced by small dollar donors. We just saw this huge national this NRSC number from January, just an explosion of small dollar donations, and that's indicative of it. But basically, I think the general mood of the donors and of the kind of Republican, just like normal Republican, meaning not a MAGA person brought into the party by Trump, just kind of conventional conservative Republican, is they don't blame. They're mad at Democrats for Black Lives Matter violence from the summer, but they don't blame Joe Biden for Black Lives Matter violence over the summer. And they had that same attitude toward what happened at the Capitol and Trump, which is basically like, he doesn't bear any more responsibility for that than Joe Biden necessarily, is to blame for the neighborhood store being burned down or what have you. It's still something that they associate together, but it's not something where they blame the guy at the top. Now, feel free to disagree with me on that, Molly. But to finish the point, the thing that I think ended up coming out of this is that Democrats got what they wanted and that Donald Trump got what he wanted. And the people who tried to manipulate this into a scenario where they could turn back the clock, take back the GOP away from its more Trumpian populism, they totally botched this moment in so many different ways. And I include that members of the media in that. I include the politicians in that. And this is another example of how, like, if Ben Sasse was actually a leader, he would have been working within his coalition to try to make this happen. And instead, you have guys like Rob Portman who have no reason to support the president in this instance. He's going to retire. He's going to go back home. And yet they are. And why is that happening? Because they were not convinced by anybody. Nobody tried to convince them. You have all these like lone wolf sort of people who just would like to go out there and get plaudits and attaboys from the media, but they don't do the work of trying to convince people in their conference to go along with them. In terms of the people who voted against, voted in favor of conviction today on the Republican side, only one of them, I think, bears any real risk, because everybody else either just got elected or is retiring in the case of Burr and Toomey. And that's Lisa Murkowski, who is up next year. and who I'm absolutely certain will get targeted by Trump because he never really liked her anyway. And she also, voted against him on a number of other things, including Supreme Court nominees and things like that. And Ann Murkowski, keep in mind, is not particularly beloved by Republicans either. And so the potential for a primary there that could turn interesting is, I think, pretty high. Other than that, I just don't think there's going to be many serious, significant consequences. Though Bill Cassidy, I think it might come up in Louisiana in the future.
Okay, there's so much there to talk about.
Sorry, I just kind of spewed that.
And just like right at the end, you're talking about Lisa Murkowski. She did once win a write-in campaign.
Yep, but that was a long time ago, and she was running against a seriously crazy person in the Republican nominee.
She's kind of a train wreck herself in that she doesn't really make sense when she's arguing what she's pushing for, but she hasn't been a total disaster in representing Alaska interests. I think it is what struck me about the McConnell thing and the Republican votes for conviction and so many other things is just how emotional our senators are. And I think there's no question. I don't even mean it in a bad way. I mean,
you reported on the Kavanaugh trial.
Well, what I mean, so for a lot of Americans, what we went through this summer with the Summer of Rage was horrific. I mean, a lot of people were scared in ways they hadn't been scared before. A lot of people lost their businesses. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of people saw that there was no rule of law or law and order, and that if you wanted that, you were called horrible things. And it was deeply threatening and alarming. Sometimes, personally, because you were right there getting your life injured, or your body injured, or your business injured, your home, your church burnt down, the federal courthouse being attacked. And I think for a lot of these senators and members of the House, that didn't resonate with them for some reason until January, at which point they were like, oh, wow, this is a really bad thing. It seems like we've got rule of law isn't taking place here. And they, I have personally talked to some of the 7 senators who genuinely were terrified. Like, they actually were worried about their lives. And I think Mitch McConnell himself, who is normally quite the operator and quite sane and sober, you might not agree with him, but he's kind of a good strategist. He's been an emotional wreck since that moment. Like, he's like, losing.
Can I suggest why?
Okay.
Can I suggest why? So this whole thing, the scene from Godfather 2 with when Michael says, in my home where I sleep, where my children play with their toys.
Yes.
This is the Capitol building is Mitch McConnell's home. They attacked his home.
Well, but I think that it was his, I do think I think it was terrifying. I'm not taking away from that. I think it was a horrible thing, I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to be there. But I think for Mitch McConnell, it was also coinciding with he's usually a better strategist, and he failed in keeping the Senate. He had a strategy. I know this personally. The strategy was sort of to enable people to vote against President Trump, but for Republican senators. He thought that was going to work. I wrote a piece like last April or saying, this is a bad strategy. If Trump goes down, the Senate goes down too. I didn't want to be right about both of those things. But in my view, it was the wrong strategy. The one McConnell took, which was basically to support the Russia collusion hoax in general, finally at the end kind of being like, oh, I guess it wasn't true. He didn't fight for the things that mattered in the last 4 years. He didn't fight against refusal to accept the 2016 election. He allowed people to just be out of control in multiple times. Yes, he did good work on judges and stuff like that. But I think people were looking for so much more support for the Republican administration, and not I'm going to try to keep the Republican Senate but get rid of the Republican president approach. So I think he's angry at himself. I think he's angry at the riot. I think he's super angry at Donald Trump that he got kind of like it didn't work. And he's just very emotional. And I kind of want to go back to the sane, sober, not such a drama queen approach that he's on.
Can just to respond to that quickly, and then I promise I won't go as long. I agree with you, Molly. I think in particular, there's one moment that you can draw out of this, which is the decision on McConnell's part when Trump brings up $2,000 checks, something that, Hawley and Sanders both agree on, something that both of the Republicans in Georgia claim to support, okay, and the Democrats in Georgia certainly support. They all say that they're going to support. They say that, we have the votes for it. McConnell doesn't want to do it, jams up the process so that there can't be a clean vote on it. And the real reason, of course, that he did that is that he didn't think they needed it. His own team was telling him the work we've got on the ground there, we've got the best ground game. We've got, we know where people are. We're getting them out. It's going to be fine. Don't worry about all the Georgia election law stuff. It's going to be okay. Loeffler and Perdue don't need you to pass $2,000 checks in order to keep the Senate. And of course, that turned out to be wrong. And then afterwards, of course, they blamed Trump for bringing up the issue, when in reality, the issue had already been brought up in Georgia and was being bandied about, and the Republicans there had already supported it. If Mitch McConnell knew, I think in retrospect, that if he had passed $2,000 checks, let's say it just saves David Perdue, he would absolutely have done it. In fact, the Republican offer to Biden from their centrist coalition of people in terms of an alternative coronavirus relief package includes checks that would add up to like $1,400 in terms of the what was passed and what they wanted to add to it. It's ridiculous. Like, it's a $600 difference, and to me, that, like, whether you think that's a good idea or not, McConnell as a political operator would say it is absolutely worth me doing this right now in order to maintain a Republican Senate for the next 2 years. And he didn't, and they lost. And I think that makes him angry as well and contributes to this situation.
Agreed.
Yeah, Molly's theory that McConnell is angry at himself is really interesting. And, this is another point that, like, since January 6th, there has not been a lot of, I think, productive reckoning on in either the Republican or the Democrat Party with the populist sentiments that are active among their base. I don't think McConnell might be angry at himself because he recognizes that, yes, we have this entire group of voters who wanted more than tax cuts, like Molly was saying. Like, they wanted more than a corporate tax cut when Republicans held the House and the Senate and the presidency all at the same time, let alone with somebody that is willing to do, I would say, as bold of things as Donald Trump was willing to do. We had Paul Ryan talking about getting people to be able to do their taxes on a postcard. And not only did he do nothing other than taxes, but just didn't even get that.
Mm-hmm. There's a. Did we lose Emily?
Oh, I think we lost her.
Okay, so there's a. I've said before that I thought Democrats got what they wanted and Trump got what they wanted, and the reason that I think that is that Democrats wanted to not actually convict Trump. They wanted him to be damaged, and they wanted to peel away some of the Republicans and cause further splits and fractures in the Republican coalition while maintaining Trump's ability to run again in the future, because they think that he's valuable to them in that effort. For Trump, I think what he wanted to get out of this was the ability to run again in the future, obviously maintain his status as the 900-pound gorilla. But then I think he also enjoys kind of having people admit that they hate him. And this was an exercise that was beautiful for that from his perspective, because now he can just hate on Liz Cheney and he can hate on all of the 7 Republicans, and he can just do it over and over again. And I think that that's something that he enjoys in terms of whatever he does next. He just always likes to have beef with everybody. And so from my perspective, they were both kind of winners in this situation.
I think Democrats actually would have taken anything. They would have taken conviction. They didn't need conviction because their real goal was sort of to unify themselves and divide their opposing party. And I don't know if anybody ever wants to go through impeachment or an impeachment trial. But I think one of the things that's really good about this moment and has been good about the last several years is just how clarifying everything has been for so many people, and also helpful for the Republican Party. The Republican Party went through quite a bit of wilderness. Actually, you were doing this debate this week, Ben, on this topic. But
Yes.
the Republican Party had some great success in the early 80s. And then it kind of went through a period where it was a little confused post-Cold War. So much of the policies were oriented around the Soviet Union, whether it was economic or military or cultural. And they kind of got a little confused and went like way different on foreign policy. So the Republican Party had sort of a long history of believing in a strong national defense, but not one that just like invaded willy-nilly. And they went through that military adventurism phase. It was hurting them electorally. They seemed to be confused about how to update their cultural conservative side of things. And their economic policies seemed more about helping large corporations than average Americans or like general American health. When you look at the last 5 years, what has happened to the Republican Party, it has been helpful and kind of decisive. Now, there are still people with different ideas on foreign policy, cultural issues. Sometimes they're like seem more from a couple decades ago. But by and large, the party seems pretty clear on the need for a strong national defense that is not confused about when to enter wars and how to get out of them. That's actually huge. They understand the threat of China being more serious than some other threats that we've been dealing with. That's huge. They care about the middle class far more than they ever used to. And that is like an electoral powerhouse. Like, you look at what happened in 2020, November, you had this massive new coalition of people that I would say that economic part of things might be the biggest part. And then on the cultural stuff, it's now just like a fight for whether you even believe in the country or not, like whether you believe in her founding principles.
Or whether you believe that it's a good thing to play the national anthem, which the White House apparently has misgivings about.
And so when you look at these votes in the House and the Senate, I think you see, yeah, there are like 10 people in the House and they're the weaker people in the Senate, and that's understood. But by and large, it's like a party that's pretty unified and understands where it's going and where it needs to go in the future to win.
I think your optimism is actually surprisingly well placed.
Emily, can we talk about one of the fun moments of the day? Ted Cruz. The pandemic has been very good to Ted Cruz when it comes to his Twitter feed. He's just balling. He's just throwing out bangers, and he is and he's got the mullet to go with it now. And anyway, he started this thread with basically, it's chaos at the impeachment trial. We're all blindsided. I thought I'd share some of the questions in the pile that didn't make the cut to be asked yesterday. These are all real from various senators who will remain anonymous. The very first one is, where's the short fat guy? Obviously referring to Jerry Nadler. And you can see some of the other ones on your screen. It's Manager Swalwell, tell us about Fang Fang. I mean, it's just
this one is generic. Have any of the House managers had sexual relations with a Chinese communist spy? Please explain.
I love Ted Cruz Unleashed. It's great.
It's so funny because his problem in I feel like one of his big problems actually in 2016 was that he came across to people as very inauthentic, and just not like as this sort of like too slick, too packaged kind of thing. And I think that what he's learned, I think, from the past 4 years, he and Marco Rubio both learned a lot of things from the last 4 years. And what Ted's learned is I'm just going to be me. This is just like, I'm not going to.
I'm just going to do me.
I'm just going to do me. Before we wrap up, I'm curious, Molly, what you think will come after this, because this was a way for like the media and Capitol Hill Democrats to really hang on to Donald Trump and like stretch it out. You had that 1 week. I think it was 2 weeks ago where there was no real Trump things happening. Impeachment hadn't happened. It hadn't moved yet. And it was just like Biden news. And CNN and MSNBC saw significant, but particularly CNN saw huge dips in their numbers.
So I was thinking about how after Biden was inaugurated, and Trump was gone, and really after Trump had been deplatformed by the tech oligarchs who run our country, the media seemed to be struggling, but it was almost like they were getting sober a little bit. They were doing this thing about how the Biden presidency was a return to normalcy, and we're going to cover like normal, which means sycophantically, of course. And they were kind of operating normally. There wasn't a lot of Trump news. There was no Trump news. And then this week with the Trump trial, it was like an addict falling off the wagon, and someone who's been clean for just a little bit then suddenly enters a room with mounds of cocaine and is just like putting the cocaine in every orifice. It was just like,
Molly, you've got the perfect analogy here. It's The Simpsons. It's Barney Gumble after he's been sober, and his reward is a giant vat of Duff beer, and he's just like, put it in my veins right now.
That's what CNN has been like all week. It's just like there's
rubbing it on their teeth.
Yes. And so I am also curious what's going to happen now that Trump has been acquitted second time, only time in history that a president has been acquitted twice in an impeachment trial. So I can't wait for the t-shirts that say like, my president has been acquitted twice.
Oh no, it's all-time greatest GOAT champion, all-time undefeated. It's going to be all like, it's going to be Jordan comparison kind of things.
Yes. But I think
he's got to make shoes.
No, I think they will never be able to quit. They will look for any example. So they'll have, they're going to be pushing people to do a very third world banana republic type thing. They need this guy in prison, and they're going to do everything they can to get him in prison, in part to feed their addiction. And so I think you will see them looking for opportunities in the future.
Emily, what do you think?
Yeah, I think something very similar to Molly. And, one of the saddest things, and I don't mean to bring the conversation down, I know we're wrapping up, but I think one of the saddest things of all of this, Molly makes a great optimistic point about the Republican Party sort of taking good lessons and shifting appropriately and not excessively from the sort of Trump era. But I particularly don't think Democrats have, especially these sort of like corporatist centrist Democrats, have learned any lessons. I see them doubling down. I think impeachment sort of proved that they've learned all of the wrong lessons, because it's a great example of the doubling down, especially today when we saw the House try to call witnesses, which would have blocked the Senate from passing stimulus relief and COVID relief. It would have really, really made that a very difficult thing. It was kind of explicitly prioritizing this political impeachment over the Senate being able to work on COVID relief checks. So that, to me, was just a fantastic example. Yes, they were able to ultimately shut it down, but those impulses still run really strong in the Democratic Party. And I think that's actually a really sort of sad thing, that we're now in the year 2021, and one of these political parties is, I think you can say it's still on both sides, but like Democrats in particular have learned basically nothing.
A perfect moment that encapsulates sort of that divide, Emily, is the Neera Tanden hearing this week, in which she congratulated Chairman Bernie Sanders on all of his leadership in what had to be like one of the most, you have to respect her on some level for like being willing to like having the villainy to twist that knife. But like Neera Tanden's like hated by everybody in Washington except for Clinton land
and lobbyists
and lobbyists, obviously, and is viewed as a troll. And for her to get up there and like troll Bernie Sanders that way, if you haven't seen it, go back and watch the like awkward John Kennedy questioning of her, where he's like reading all of her mean tweets, and he's like, "Now, did you believe that at the time?" And she's saying, "I feel badly about them. Social media is a toxic environment." I mean, it's pretty amusing, but that just shows you who won control, in the sense that the Sanders, the momentum, the progressive wing of the party really felt like, they had an opportunity this time around, but you're ending up with aged, decrepit neoliberals who are going to essentially try to buy off the progressives by pretending to be super woke and down with the anti-racist agenda, the identity politics, agenda, the response to the question about Janet Yellen. Well, she is the first female Treasury Secretary.
So good.
And so anyway,
sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Molly.
That thing bothered me so much. There's like that feminist statement about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and how Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in high heels, which, is true, but also Fred Astaire is amazing. So it's kind of a stupid thing to say. But I always think about that when I'm watching Democrats engage with the media. Like, Republican press secretaries have to do everything that Democratic press secretaries are doing, except with a totally hostile audience where those types of answers would never get you 1 yard advancement. And it's just awful to see how easy it is for like these, it's not really that impressive that these people have jobs or that they advance themselves when they are so bad at what they do, but they just have a very friendly, sorry, just Molly Hemingway has no face. They just don't have any. They don't have any challenges when they're doing their press work. It's just ridiculous.
Well, let's wrap up with this. Just real quick, I think that the outcome of this impeachment will ultimately further solidify Republicans and will actually lead to some recriminations among Democrats about how they might have played it differently. I think that will be papered over by the media, and that they will just try to move on, and that ultimately this will not be an issue that people care about in the same way that the last impeachment was, within months, not something people cared about. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, this second impeachment is somehow less serious than the first impeachment, even though the underlying issue was more serious. And within 9 months of that first impeachment, not a single Democrat mentioned it at their convention held once every 4 years to talk about their biggest achievements. They didn't want to even mention that they'd done it. The lesson they learned from that on the eve of COVID hitting the country was that while still dealing with COVID, we should run another impeachment, and that will be a political winner. I don't think it's a winner. I think that they really mistook the passions of the moment. I mean, it was very shocking and awful what people saw happen. They needed some sober, clear-thinking individuals. They unfortunately didn't get that many on either side of the aisle, but certainly I think, the Republicans who have consistently opposed political violence for the last year, Democrats have not done that. And that's kind of the takeaway message, I think. You had Republicans say the summer of rage was wrong. The incursion of the Capitol was wrong. Democrats praised, supported, bailed out rioters, or declined to say anything during the summer of rage. And they made big hay about this, trying to blame one individual for the actions of these other people. And it just, in the long run, that doesn't seem like people who are very serious about the actual problems that are in our country that have, frankly, nothing to do with Donald Trump.
I just want to say, to the extent that this lingers with us and stays in the sort of public imagination, I think it's that Democrats have again lowered the precedent for some of these emergency powers. And we know that they don't care about norms, even though they just spent the last 4 years crying about them. We know they don't, because they want to pack the Supreme Court. They want to add states. They want to do all of these different things. We saw the way President Obama used executive orders. We've seen the way that Joe Biden has used executive orders already. And now this impeachment, I don't think people were batting an eye outside the Beltway about. And I think it has further politicized an emergency power. And to the extent that this stays with us and lingers in our consciousness, it's that we now have, the last impeachment did that too, but this furthered it. And so we now just have another lowered standard for our our crucial and sacred constitutional powers.
And we can leave it at that. Yes, the last Norm standing is Norm Macdonald, that old lump of coal.
As it should be.
As it should be. All right, boys and girls, thanks so much for joining us for this not really emergency edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray. Perfect.